All right, welcome everyone. Thank you all for coming today. My name is Kenzie Luderbach, and I'm the events coordinator with the Office of Sustainability on campus, and we're so glad to have everyone here today. If you're here for Smiley professional credit, make sure to swipe your ID at the table over there before you head out. I'd like to start by thanking a couple of groups who sponsored this event: the School of Behavioral and Social Sciences, the School of Humanities and Global Studies, Diversity and College Access, the Office of the Chancellor, and UW Extension Lakes. Let's get a round of applause for these groups. I also want to give a big thank you to John Francis for coming to campus to speak today. John Francis, also known as the Planetwalker, is an author, traveler, teacher, and much more. He was the National Geographic Society's first educational fellow and is the program director of Planetwalk, a nonprofit environmental awareness organization. John took a vow of silence for 17 years and spent 22 years traveling across the world without the use of motorized transportation, carrying a message of respect for the earth. He aims to educate people on the physical and human environment, believing that our behavior towards one another can be a mechanism for how we treat the earth. Before we welcome John up to stage, let's watch a quick video.
Time again, and you can be sure that there will be many speeches urging young people to go out there and change the world. And those same young people will be wondering how. Well, tonight we have the story of one man who set about changing the world by first changing himself. Our story begins on a misty night in 1971 when two oil tankers collide beneath the Golden Gate Bridge, spilling more than 500,000 gallons of crude into the bay. At that time, John Francis was just another hippie living in West Marin County. But when he saw the oozing sludge and dying birds, he wanted to protest in a way that others thought was crazy. Francis wanted to stop riding in cars.
And I found myself on the road walking, and I said, well, I'm already walking here. I'm just going to keep walking.
With his banjo as his companion, John Francis challenged anyone who would listen to believe in his mission.
I found myself arguing with my friends if one person could make a difference by not riding in an automobile.
So he had another idea. To stop the arguments, he would simply stop talking.
I decided that I would stop speaking just for one day to give my community a gift of my silence, because John was a big talker.
This is Francis back then. He was 27 years old on the day he stopped talking in order to truly listen. That day's silence lasted 17 years.
When I first stopped speaking, I could hear all the conversations pretty much that I ever had. After about a month of not speaking, they soon went away.
Without the conversations, John had only to listen to himself, and what he heard disturbed him. He realized that he had been living a lie about who he was as a black man in a white world.
What I saw in the media was that I could be a buffoon, or I could be a criminal, but could I be the person I am right now? And I didn't see that person. It took me to just stop talking until I said, oh my God, there you are. and then I just rediscovered who I was. And I didn't need to lie. Well, I couldn't lie because I didn't talk. I mean, I just couldn't do it.
Francis went from being this know-it-all to someone who wanted to know more. So he began a pilgrimage that left his footprints across the country.
John Francis. Linda Lindell.
Just taken a ride, walked all the way.
I saw America. I heard America speak to me. And I was very taken by what my experience was.
What Francis didn't know at that time was that he was ahead of his time, on the forefront of what would become a movement, environmentalism. When he found that Southern Oregon University offered a new course in environmental studies, he walked to Ashland and enrolled. He then walked to Missoula, Montana to get a master's degree, eventually ending up at the University of Wisconsin to get his PhD. Along the way, he also taught a discussion class. Remember, all without speaking.
Sometimes I would make these signs like so. And my class would sit around, they go, "What's he saying? What's he saying?" "No, I think he's talking about clear cutting." No, that's not clear cutting. He was using a handsaw, and he wouldn't clear cut with it. You can clear cut with a handsaw. I think he's talking about selective forestry. And I would just kind of back out, because this is a discussion class, and let the discussion go on.
And Francis's education was evolving as well.
I thought environment was about human-made ugliness and pollution and endangered species. I started to realize that environment was really much more than that. That it involved, human rights and civil rights and economic equity and how we treat each other when we meet each other.
All along his journey from West Coast to East, the man who walked and didn't talk was being heard. In the 22 years he spent trekking across America, the once counterculture concept of environmentalism had become mainstream. By the time he arrived in Washington, D.C., the U.S. Coast Guard invited him to write pollution regulations for the nation's waterways, and the United Nations appointed him environmental ambassador.
I couldn't have dreamed that up. I couldn't have seen it. When people said, one person can't make a difference, I have to say there were doubts sometimes, as I'm walking, and I am alone, and I am just a black man with a banjo walking across America. I think we just make that commitment to make the journey. And once we commit ourselves to doing it, we change. We change ourselves from just sitting on the fence thinking about it to actually jumping in the field and making a mad dash or a slow walk. And I think that's our journey. That's all of our journeys. I think each one of us has that journey, that potential in ourselves to do that.
John Francis just published a book called Planetwalker and is getting ready for another walk across the United States. Graduation time again.
All right, everyone, let's give a big welcome to John Francis.
Well, thank you very much. And let me thank you all for being here. It's very important, very special to be here with you. And I want to thank all the organizations here at the school that got me to be here. I'm so pleased. I remember when I first started speaking, the first words that I spoke were, "Thank you for being here." It was in Washington, D.C. on the 20th anniversary of Earth Day. And I said thank you for being here because after 17 years of not speaking, I realized how important it was to have someone listen to you. And so I was thanking the audience that had come to hear me and come to listen to me, that they were there, and because without them there would be no communication. And I'm in a walk in Africa right now, although I'm here. So I started a walk in Africa, in South Africa, and it's about 6,000-mile walk from Cape Town to Khartoum in the Sudan. And they're having a hard time in the Sudan right now, and I hope by the time I get there, there's going to be peace. So I'm going to dedicate my walk to peace in the world and peace everywhere. So anyway, the word that I got from South Africa, and maybe some of you know it, it's kind of going around the world, it's called Ubuntu. And what it means, does anyone know that word, or have you heard that word? Or, Dave has. Well, I'll explain it. Word is a word that means I am because you are. So it really says to me what community is about and who we are. We are because of each other. We don't exist without each other, without one another. And so when I started to speak 17 years ago, I played the banjo, and I said, "Thank you for being here." And my mother out in the audience, and I love to tell the story, my mother out in the audience, she jumped up out of her seat, and she said, "Hallelujah, Johnny's talking." I can just see her there now, you know, jumping up out of her seat. My dad said, "That's one. That's one." And that's because he followed me all the way across America when I started walking. He would come to different places, especially if I was graduating from college, from university. He would say, "This is great, John, that you could go to school without talking and graduate. Your mother and I are very proud of you. But what are you going to do with a bachelor's degree if you don't ride in cars and talk?" And I would hunch my shoulders and grab my banjo, put my pack on, and I'd start walking. I get to the next school. I'm working on my master's degree, and I get a master's degree. I graduate, and my dad flies out with family, and he's so happy and proud, and he goes, "Son, I don't want you to think your mom and I are not proud. But what are you going to do with a master's degree if you don't ride in cars and talk?" So I just hunched my shoulders, grabbed my banjo and my pack, and went on. Sometimes I would stop and work. I remember getting to Watertown, South Dakota. It's not so far from here. And I worked as a printer in Watertown. Yep, worked as a printer. And one of my friends there was Amos Spider. He was that Sioux. He was Ogallala Sioux. And he said, "John, you don't talk and you're walking. Well, this is a great vision quest." Called it a vision quest. He says, "And my family, we want to make a honor blanket for you, and we want to have a powwow here in Watertown, South Dakota." And he said, he started planning to make a powwow, and he got Gary Holybull from Minnesota to come down, and he got the Philandro School to send their students up, and they were going to dance, and we did the snake dance, and it was just wonderful. My dad flew out from Philadelphia, from New Jersey, and he was there, and he just watched what was going on, and he said, "John, how do you do this? How do you come to a place you don't know anybody, and now you have
are the Indians and the white people dancing together. And you're a black man. I hunched my shoulders and showed him the letter that I got from the University of Wisconsin. It was a letter that said, we would like you to come to our school. We think that we'd be great in our PhD program, and we would support you. And I wanted to show that to my dad, because anything having to do with money, he was right on it. And he would say, yeah, who's going to pay for that? Who's going to pay for it when you do this? Where are you going to get the money from? So I showed him this letter, and he looked at it, and he said to me, it sounds like they're going to give you money. So I was very pleased, because that's what I thought, but I wasn't going to believe that unless my dad said so. So I came to the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and I walked in. I walked in, and I had been there for like a few months, and nothing happened. I didn't hear anything about this fellowship, and finally my advisor said to me, John, you have to go up to Bascom Hill and talk to the dean about the fellowship. And I walked up to Bascom Hill. There in the dean's office, all the secretaries were typing away. There were typewriters then, there were all kinds of, we didn't have the computers yet. And the typewriters were clicking away, and in walks the dean. He looks at me and he goes into his office. So I walked in after him. He said, the dean will see you now. I walked in and he sat down and he goes, so I hear you walked here, and he says, yeah. And so where did you sleep? Where did you sleep? Oh, you slept in a tent, in a sleeping bag? Well, how did you eat? You cooked your food over a fire? And you want to go to school here? Just a minute. And he walked back out into the outer office. And there were the secretaries had been typing. It was complete silence. And he says, I can understand them. I actually can understand them. And then he came back in and he said, so where are you going to live? And I went, he says, oh, well, you're going to get a fellowship and you're going to have money to rent a place. Just don't worry about that. And so I did get this fellowship. But it was a long time before I got it, because they just didn't want to give it to somebody that didn't talk. Until I got and visited the dean, and he realized that there was some kind of communication going on and that it's okay. So I got this fellowship at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and I started taking classes. And I had no idea that I was going to write on oil spills. But after I finished my examinations and took all the classes that I had taken, my major professor asked, well, what are you going to write on? And I just didn't know. And then I decided, oh, well, oil spills. And he said, thank God you decided that, because he was someone who had written on oil spills, the blowout in 1969 in Santa Barbara that really started the environmental movement. And he just didn't want to push it on me, but that I was walking because of an oil spill, it just seemed like the most natural thing that I should be writing about. Now I started writing about oil spills. I started doing my research on oil spills, and I came up with lots of data that I was going to use in my dissertation. And my colleagues at the university said, John, why are you studying oil spills? What kind of job do you think you're going to get? Nobody's interested in oil spills. This was in 1989. But in 1989, the March of 1989, the 29th of March, everything changed. That's Exxon Valdez. When Exxon Valdez, everybody wanted to know about oil spills. Who's studying oil spills? And the Coast Guard calls up because, yes, this is Admiral Henn, U.S. Coast Guard, yes. Washington, we're in Washington, D.C., and we want to speak to a student you have there. Is he a doctoral student, Dr. John Francis? He's not a doctor yet. Yeah, we want to speak to him. Pardon me? He doesn't speak? Oh, I'm so sad. Oh, he's got vow of silence? Well, we wanted him to come out to Washington and help us write these regulations. Pardon me? He only walks? Is there somebody normal at your university that we can talk to? And so that was my major professor, John Steinhardt, and they talked with the admiral and told him all the things he needed to know. My dad came out. My dad, he's so happy to see me. I had a roll of keys, you know, different rooms and labs and things. I had these keys, and that impressed him. You must be doing something. You got keys. My sister said I should leave you alone because you seem to be doing so much better when you're not saying anything. But what are you going to do with a PhD if you don't ride in cars and talk? They're a dime a dozen. I hunched my shoulders. I hugged my dad. I grabbed my banjo and I started walking east. And I got to Cape May, New Jersey. It was 7 years and 1 day from the time I left the West Coast to the time I arrived on the East Coast. The East touched my foot in the water, the Atlantic, and had touched my foot in the water of the Pacific. And by the time I got there, it was 7 years and 1 day. That's how long it took me to walk across the country. And I started to speak. I wanted to speak, and every year on my birthday, I asked myself, is it time to speak? Is it still appropriate? Do I have anything to say? And at this time I said, you have something to say. So it's going to be, when are you going to speak? I was looking for an opportunity to speak. I wanted to speak, and so I chose Earth Day because I wanted to remind myself that I was going to speak for the environment. I was going to speak for the environment, but that had changed from being just about loss of species and habitat and climate change and all very important things, But I learned that in my formal education all the way up to a PhD in Wisconsin. But what I didn't learn and what I did learn in my informal education, which was on the road and with all the people that I listened to for 17 years, that people were part of the environment. And because people were part of the environment, because we're part of the environment, the first opportunity we have to treat the environment in a sustainable way, or even understand what we mean by sustainability, is with the relationships we have with each other. So when we think about sustainability, and I was just talking to someone yesterday, and he talked about the 7 generations that we look ahead, 7 generations and 7 generations behind. How are we doing things so that 7 generations from now, things are going to be better than they are? And this comes from this indigenous knowledge that sometimes we forget, we neglect to look at what's been before us, what's worked well before us. So I came up with this idea that if we oppressed each other, if we exploited each other, if we fought over resources, then what's going to happen? It's going to manifest in the physical environment around us. So what we have to do in order to change that power dynamic, it's going to sound silly, but it's we have to be kind to each other. We have to care for each other. I know it doesn't really sound silly to some of you. It's like, oh yeah, I get it, you know. And because as we treat each other, that's going to manifest in the environment around us. I know it's just a little thing. I know it's just a little thing. But the name of this talk, and I started out with this, it's as we aspire, so we shall become. And I have to think back to the time when I started walking. I didn't have any degrees, nothing. I just felt that I had to do something because of the birds were dying and the fish were dying and the seals were covered in oil. I had to do something. Now, if someone would have told me, John, if you really want to make a difference, get out of your car. Get out of your car. Yep, you can grab the banjo. You're going to have to learn how to play it, though. And just walk east. And you're going to make a difference. And as I got just a little farther on, they shouted at me, and shut up, too! And you're really going to make a difference. You're really going to make a difference. Just shut up and listen. I would have thought, that they had been doing too much of the leaf or whatever it is that they do in California. Yeah, you know what I'm saying. And so that's what happened. I mean, when I graduated, and I'll tell you, when I graduated, my first degree was a bachelor's degree from the University of Southern Oregon, which was in college at that point. And they said, you have to write a long-term goal and a short-term goal. And my long-term goal, or my short-term goal, was just to finish school, because I was like, I could only do so much being in the classroom. And the other was the long-term goal, which is to walk and sail around the world as part of my education in the spirit and hope that I could be a benefit to all of us, but I didn't know what that meant. And I figured that maybe I would learn along the way. Maybe I would learn along the way. And I say that to you because just think of yourselves in school now, the students who are here in school. Think of yourselves as like getting ready to make your journey. You're on your journey. And knowing that you can make a difference. You won't know what it is, but you have to be on that journey. You have to have that commitment. Make it inside yourself to do those things that you know are going to make a difference. And you're going to find yourself in a place where you go, oh my gosh, how did I get here? Because as we aspire, so we shall become. As we dream, as we imagine, we have to imagine the world as a better place. We have to be able to imagine that. And we have to be able to imagine and aspire for us to be part of it. All of us to be part of it. So as we aspire, so we shall become. I want to leave some time for our conversation and our questions. But I did start speaking, and the Coast Guard did call me again. And I was in Vermont, and they called and said, John, we would like you to come to Washington and help write regulations. I had my PhD by that time. I defended over the telephone when I started talking. And my major professor was so happy that I started speaking. He said, "John, you won't regret this." He had tears in his eye. He was crying. He said, "You won't regret this." And so when the Coast Guard called, I could answer the phone. And I said, "Yes, this is John Francis." And they said, "We want you to come to Washington." And they named some huge figure, of what they wanted to pay me to come to Washington and help write regulations for the country. Oil pollution regulations. And they said, "We could send you." I agreed. I said, "We can send you a ticket, a plane ticket. You can fly down and we will." I said, "Oh, you know what I said." "I'm sorry, I don't fly in planes." They said, "Dr. Francis, that's all right. That's okay. You can take the train. You can take the train and we'll reimburse you." "Oh, well, I don't take the trains either." There was a long silence on the phone. "Dr. Francis, you don't ride in cars either, do you?" "No, I don't." And all the dollar signs went flittering off where I was going to work. They say, "Well, we'll get back to you." I was like, huh. And I was like, I should start riding and driving. My dad was right. But I hadn't reached that point yet. The phone rings again. Next day. "Hello?" "Yes. It's the Coast Guard." Wow. Their boss says they absolutely have to have me. How can I get there? "Well, I can ride my bicycle." "How long will it take?" "About 2 months." They said they'll be waiting. So the Coast Guard, that's the U.S. Coast Guard, said they'll be waiting for me to get to Washington on my bicycle so I can work for them. I got to call my dad. "Dad, yeah, guess what? I got a job." "Yeah, a real job." "Yep, with the Coast Guard." "What Coast Guard?" "The U.S. Coast Guard." "Do they know who I am?" I think so." "Who do they think I am?" I don't know, Dr. Francis." That's the first time I used Dr. Francis to my dad. And he said, the world certainly had changed. And it really had, because my dad could never imagine me working for the U.S. government. And hardly could I ever imagine working for the government, because I was one of those guys with the sign, protesting about, one war or another and people dying. And they were taking pictures, I'm sure. And my dad told me, "You'll never work for the government." And I said, "Well, I don't think I want to." But here I am now, working at the Coast Guard, and I'm riding my bicycle down to Washington, D.C., and I get a job at the Coast Guard. I'm working there at the Coast Guard writing oil pollution regulations. I'm the project manager and the environmental analyst for the United States Coast Guard. It's hard for me to believe. It's hard for me to believe. But as we aspire, so shall we become. I couldn't have seen that. But there are lots of things that we can't see. But as we aspire, so shall we become. And I'm saying that to you because just keep moving. Just keep moving. As we aspire, so we shall become. And I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to play Life Celebration on the banjo. And that's what I played all the way across America, on this banjo. Well, thank you very much, and I would love to attempt to answer any questions you might have. And so I'm going to come out, and maybe I could use the other microphone, and I'll turn this one off. And this is where I get really close to my audience. And being hearing challenged, I'm going to really get close to you when you ask a question. So if you raise your hand for asking a question, I will come over to you. Excuse me.
What were some of the things you learned about the people along the way?
Something crazy?
Anything.
What
types of things did
you know, I had some really interesting times. Something I learned about the people along the way. Well, one, I learned that people are pretty much people. And I would be walking down the road, and someone would drive up next to me. And they would say to me, "Hey boy, you know how to play that banjo?" "Well, damn, you do. You know how to play that banjo. Do you need a place to stay? We live about 10 miles down the road. You turn left right in this little holler, and our house is there. You're welcome to come there and stay and rest up." I would get there, 10 miles, and I'd knock on the door. Now, I have to tell you, you ever know those movies where the monster's down in the basement, and that's just where the people are going? They're going down the basement, and you go, "Don't go down in the basement. It's where the monster is." Well, I could hear my parents' voice in my head. "Don't you knock on that door. Don't you knock on that door." But I would be, the door would open. I'd look. "Oh, what's the matter, John? Ain't you ever seen that many guns on the wall before? Come on in." I'd go in, and they'd be on the phone. I said, "Oh, this is where it happens now." Phone. "You know that boy we seen walking down the road with the banjo?" "I play the banjo." "That's right, he's here." "Nope, he can't come to your house for dinner. He's staying at our house." "No, not tomorrow either. Billy Bob's taking him to school tomorrow for show and tell." That was one thing. The other thing, which I thought was really funny, is as I get to some towns, they say, "Where did you come from?" And I go, "Oh God, did you get molested back there? Those people have a bad reputation. We're going to take care of you though here in this town. We got the Chamber of Commerce has a hotel for you. You can have food over at the cafe. Now, oh, you're going that way, huh? I don't know about that town." Well, they don't have such a good reputation either. When I get to that town, of course, you heard this word called parochial, right? "Where'd you come from?" "Oh, did those guys molest you?" "We're going to treat you good here because we're good people. But those people over there, I don't know." I hope that answers your question.
When you stopped speaking, didn't you find it incredibly frustrating and even burdensome not to talk all that time?
Wow, frustrating and burdensome. Yeah. Even when I spoke, it was more frustrating and it was more burdensome because I was making stuff up and couldn't even remember what I made up from the last time to the next time. But when I stopped speaking, I realized I didn't have to make anything up. It was like such a relief that I didn't have to answer questions and make stories up that were not true in order to make myself look good. The reason I stopped talking, well, the reason why I kept silent was that when I spoke, someone would be speaking to me and I would just listen just enough to think I knew what they were going to say. Thinking I knew what they hadn't said it yet. I'm just thinking I knew what they were going to say. And then I would stop listening to them and start thinking in my mind, based on what I thought they were going to say, how I was going to show that I knew the right answer, that their answer was wrong. I could say it better even if it was what I thought. But if it was something that was different from what I already knew or what I thought I knew, I just couldn't get through. And what I realized after those few days of not speaking was that I had stopped learning because I didn't listen. And what was a very sad and happy, the sad day part of the day was I had missed all this opportunity to learn. And the happy part of that was that I could go from this day forward and practice listening to everyone, because everyone has something to teach. Everyone does. So it was really I was really happy to listen, and that was my, vehicle, was walking across America and being with people that my parents would be afraid of, or that I would never have been able to sit down with and have a conversation, and to listen to what they had to say. So, and that's where I got that we're all part of the environment, and we're all have to treat each other that way, because how we treat each other is going to manifest in the physical environment. That's not to say we shouldn't be saving the trees and and looking at endangered species and trying to save endangered species and all the disciplines and trying to do that in this physical sense, but it gives it much more power and energy if we're also kind to each other. If we're also kind to each other, we also love each other and can forgive each other. It's just going to make us a better place. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay.
Do you still walk everywhere you go?
Watch me. Yeah, that's a good question, because no, I don't. I mean, I walk everywhere I go, but I get into machines now, and it happened and I can explain that, it happened in Venezuela. As I was in Venezuela walking, I walked through this prison town called El Dorado. And El Dorado is an infamous prison with the island of Devil's Island off the coast. And lots of infamous prisoners have been there, famous prisoners. I think Papillon, who was and lots of people from, political prisoners from Venezuela. But as I was walking through there, I had this, I guess it was a epiphany, because I thought, well, the commander that I had, the commandante, I had slept by a river with his regiment, and I was on my way to Brazil, and he says, look, when you go past the prison, they're probably going to challenge you, but it's okay, there's just been a lot of people escaping, and so we have to be careful. And so I thought, oh my God, that's right. I'm going to see if this if this disguise I'm wearing, I can escape. So I get to the prison, and sure enough, the guard comes out and he goes, "Pasaporte, pasaporte." And I say, "Look, I don't have to show you my passport. It's in the back of my backpack. It's at the bottom. I'm Dr. Francis. I'm a UN Goodwill Ambassador, and I'm walking around the world." And he looks at me, and I say, "And if you don't believe me, go back and ask Comandante Jesus." And I just continue walking on. This is totally unlike me to do something like that. You know, especially with somebody's pointing an M16 at you. I would simply go, "I'll find that passport for you. It's in the back of my..." But as I walked away, I got about maybe 100 yards away, and I was in the forest, and I go, "Free at last. Oh, I'm free at last. Thank God Almighty, free at last." Well, those aren't my words, but they were what was swinging around in my head, and I realized, I go, what did I do that for? What was going on? And I realized that I was in prison, and I was trying to escape. I needed to escape, and that I'm the person who had the key to get out. And the prison that I was in was that I didn't ride in motorized vehicles, ever. It wasn't an issue. And when I stopped speaking, every year, you'll remember, on my birthday, I would ask myself, is this still appropriate? And it would be until 17 years later, I said, "Okay, now it's time for you to talk, because you have something to say." For me, in not riding in automobiles or motorized vehicles was something that I never revisited. I never asked myself, "John, is this still appropriate? Does this still work?" And so I realized I was going to have to change. My parents were back in New Jersey and Cape May and Philadelphia, and I was probably never going to see them again if I had kept walking like that. I was now a PhD in environmental studies, that the university had, people there had put out money and energy and effort for me to get a PhD. I was also a UN Goodwill Ambassador to the world's grassroots community. And sure, I was meeting a lot of grassroots communities, but they were only as far as I could walk. And so I decided, when I got to the border of Brazil, I was going to change that. I was going to get in motorized vehicles. I was going to fly home, scare my parents, of course, and I was going to work and use my degree and use the position as a Goodwill Ambassador, and then come back to where I left off and then continue walking. And so I did that all the way until I reached Buenos Aires and was flown to Antarctica. And I spent 2 weeks in Antarctica, a month in Antarctica, walking around until I took a ship, a Argentine ship, and they put me back on Ushuaia. And I walked back up to Buenos Aires, and I thought, oh boy, I had to get back by May 30th, I think. And I thought, I'll never do it. I got there in January, and I had to walk back to Buenos Aires to catch my flight back home. I made it, but every walk I take, it's always, God, this is really hard. I think I've outstretched myself or something, and now I'm in Africa, and I'm like going, wow, 5,000 miles, that's a long way. So I'm working on that. But that's how come I started riding and driving in cars, and otherwise I wouldn't be here today with you. And so I hope that you get something from this and make it worth your while and my while for being able to put myself in a can and fly out here. And so Any other questions?
You might have said this already, but which countries and which continents did you walk over, and did you have trouble with foreign languages, or do you just speak multiple languages yourself? Were you able to communicate with people in foreign languages? And which countries, which states of the United States did you go to?
Okay, that's a good question. The states in the United States, I'll take that first, that I walked across were from California up to Oregon, to Washington State, to Port Townsend. I built a boat in Port Townsend, rowed that boat across Puget Sound, yep, and then sold the boat. Somebody came up from California to buy that boat. And then I walked across Washington, Idaho, and into Montana and down to Missoula. 2 years earlier, I had made application to the University of Montana for the Master's in Environmental Studies, and they asked me when I could get there, and I said I would be there in about 2 years because I'm walking. And when I did get there, and I did, you know that sign. They asked me if I was ready to go to school, and I showed them that, and they said, don't worry about that, come back tomorrow, we'll take care of it. And I came back the next day, they gave me $100, and they said, go register for one class, reading and conference. You're going to South America, aren't you? And I had no idea, and I said okay, reading and conference, you can, the hydrological systems of South America. So, rivers of South America, okay. So they said, you do that, and when you get back here, you will have registered, you will be matriculating in the university, so we can give you a key so you can have your office because you're a graduate student, and you can use the library, and we talked to all your professors, and they decided to let you take their classes without registering for them and save your grade so that when we figure out how to get the money, then you can just register for those classes and they'll just give you the grade. And this was a different kind of financial aid that I've ever heard before. Montana, back into Idaho, turn left through the Arco Desert, Wyoming, South Dakota, through South Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, drop down into Illinois, over to Indiana, Ohio, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. And so that's the United States. And I didn't have too much trouble speaking the language, understanding, when I started speaking again. When I left after the Coast Guard, I sailed down through the Caribbean because I wanted to go to Antigua, which is where my father's family is from. So I spent a few years in Antigua, man. And so Antigua me come from, and walking down by the water, you see, so I can talk that way too. And then I got to Venezuela, and so habla español, aprender en la calle. So I do speak bastante, enough Spanish that I learned in the street or on the road, and I would get someplace and try to learn the language. And the same with Brazil, which isn't not exactly Spanish, but fala português. Yeah, sí falo. Yeah, bom dia, tudo bom? So something like that. And then back so let's see, Brazil, Amazon, up to Bolivia. Now they have some Quechua there. I never really could pick up the Quechua, but they also speak Spanish. And then all the way to the Altiplano, down into Buenos Aires, and Spanish again. And then to Chile and And then the Antarctica, you know, with the penguins, you got to watch those penguins because they'll give you a stone and it's like they go out and they make these nests, see? And so they have the idea where they try to get somebody to say, hey, you want to make a nest with me? But they don't really want to make a nest. They just want you to get some stones for them because they already have somebody they want to make a nest with. So you got to watch the penguins. And now I'm in Africa. And so Ubuntu is a word, but I did learn some other, it's Hassa. And it's, the talk is, when I say, and my friend says, Marlo is like say hello to one person. Mareni, that's to say hello to everybody. And then to say, what would I say back is away. That was what I would say when someone would say Marlo to me. So yeah, I like to pick up some, you know, useful phrases in language wherever I am.
That was South Africa.
Now it's in South Africa. That's where I am now. I just walked the first 100 miles of the 5,000. I have a long way to go.
Up to Egypt.
So during your period of not riding in automobiles, you mentioned earlier that you took a boat up in Oregon, was it? What was your view on boats? Were there any boat journeys going across the Mississippi at all?
Yeah.
Or?
Thank you. Yes. When I finished my undergraduate at Southern Oregon State University, I returned to the Bay Area, and as a treat for myself, because I had finished college, I apprenticed as a wooden boat builder. So for a year and a half, I apprenticed as a boat builder, and then someone asked me to build a boat for them, right? And I'm going up to Washington, I'll build it up there. And so they came up and got it when I rode it over Puget Sound. When I got to the East Coast, there was my boat building teacher had a whole network of boat builders, and so they put me in contact with some boat builders in Martha's Vineyard, and I sailed down through the Caribbean in a 71-foot wooden sloop. Well, it was a yawl, and then from there, different boats to Venezuela. Okay? All right. Anybody else?
As you said, as we aspire, we will become. My question is, right now, what is it you still aspire to be?
Good question. And the answer is that I'm not sure what it should look like. I don't know what it would look like, but I want and aspire to be the same that I was when I started out, that I could be a benefit to all of us, the living and the non-living parts of the planet. What is that going to look like? I don't know. And who I'm going to be as I go on, I don't know. Although I do know that, you know, life is eternal. The body dies, and as we aspire, so will we rise. That's my belief. So.
Thank you for being here. I don't have so much of a question as just to tell you that as a university, we actually at one time had a lot in common with you. For 20-some years, groups of students from this university would do something that they called the Eagle Walk. from 1982 to about 2000 something. I know I participated in, I think, the 20th walk. And we would leave over spring break, and we would walk 200 miles. And in order to walk, we would have to raise $200. And we would walk to southwestern Wisconsin and raise money for the ego research down there. There was a center that participated in that. And just listening to you brought back so many memories that we went in it for the wildlife and the research and protection, but probably some of the best parts were meeting the people and the communities along the way that looked forward to us. You know, we would sleep in schools, in gymnasiums, in churches, in community centers, and every community looked forward to us coming, and they would have meals planned for us. And I remember everybody would say, if you can make it through the first 3 days, your body will just succumb and you can make it the rest of the way. And it was just a wonderful thing that we did as a university, and over the years it faded, but I appreciate all that you did, and sometimes it really is the small things that bring the greatest amount of attention. So thank you.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. And I don't know if I mentioned this, but when I was a visiting professor, I think in 2011, and in Madison, I would take my students on a planet walk, I called it, over spring break. And I was telling someone it was always cold, it was always snowing, and and we were saying, well, let's move it to May. Well, it was always cold, it was always snowing, and the last time we moved it to June, it was perfect. But just like you say, it's the people that we meet. My students said, you know, they couldn't imagine that they would get to a town and people would come out and want to take care of them and help them and show them that they had some place to stay and make sure they had food because of what they were doing. So that it was a good side of America that would come out and support us. So any other questions? Because we're getting right. Let's see, you'll be, if you can want two more, you're the last question. If you're one more, after you. Okay.
Do you think you would have had a similar experience if you had started this like in this day and age?
Well, that's a good question, because you know, this generation is really, wow. You have some things that you really have to be able to deal with. And I know you'll be able to do it, but when I started, I didn't have a phone. You know, I was really right where I was. I couldn't really, you know, talk to people that were 100 miles away. I mean, I could write a letter and put it in the post and send it off and then have it come back to a general delivery, and I would write them and say, I'm going to be in Watertown, you know, next week, and then send that, and I might get a letter. But I mean, we have so much, the technology has changed the playing field. It's just going to be difficult to do exactly what I say, but I'm not saying you should do that, you know, like what I did. I mean, you have your own journey, your own path. It's going to look like how you want it to look, not like how my journey was or how I wanted to look. But I think people are the same. I remember when I started walking, if I said environment, people kind of looked at me like, you know, you're doing this for the environment? What's that? But that was back in the 70s, you know, in the 80s. But when I got to the East Coast, now you say environment, people are like, oh yeah, you know, we're just trying to figure out what we need to do, or we have some argument about how we're going to, you know, maintain the environment or whatever. But our consciousness has raised. But people and the goodness in people, and I think think is the same. I just finished writing this book, and I only have this one copy. They're not for sale, but if you want, they're on Amazon. It's called Human Kindness. And I believe that human kindness, and these are true stories of compassion and generosity that changed the world. It's a children's book, and somebody said to me, God, children, I don't know, they're not going to make it. It says, I'm just focusing on adults. And I said, well, who do you think buys children's books and reads them over and over and over and over and over until they get it? They go, wow, yeah. So I think kindness is, I think we're doing okay. I know we're seeing the news where a lot of people are, being hurt. We hurt each other. But I think you can do something. We here can do something by being kind just in the circle that we have, just in the places that we can be kind in, because that's going to make a difference. It will make a difference. And I believe it can change the world. So along with the work that you're doing, if you are kind and care and give people respect, and the golden rule, treat others the way you think you would like to be treated, it's going to work, and your journey can work as well. Okay, one last question.
I'm just wondering if you can expand on your experiences with peace, finding that both sort of personally and what that looked like on your walk, or broadly on a societal lens, what you've experienced around that theme or idea, and then possibly what connections or what roles you see that playing in sustainability more broadly.
Wow, you would ask a question like that. And yeah, peace. Well, I think peace is a word that we, or a concept that is maybe we don't really mean peace as much as we mean being able to be in conflict and still care for each other and still listen to each other. And so the years that I spent not speaking really helped me understand that it's important to listen to each other. It's important to listen to ideas that are really different than us, because the answer, when this is, I guess, came from me not teaching and teaching and not speaking when I taught, was that sometimes I would make a sign, and you saw in the video I'd make this sign and like that, and my students would come up with things, and sometimes they came up with things that were different than I meant, and I realized, oh God, I should have meant that. But they came up with it. The other thing is that as I communicated with people, I realized that my communication wasn't so much as I was telling someone anything, that what it was that we kind of agreed on something. We agreed on a meaning, and I was able to accept what that meaning was. And sometimes it was beyond what I thought, but coming from another person, they would say, well, that was my idea. I mean, I would be making signs and trying to convey one thing, and they would come up with something, but what they would come up with was from them, from what they believed and how they would say it. And so there was a lot of times where argument just was evaporated because we just agreed. And as I mentioned to you earlier, it's like it was bigger than me. You know, like that I would think that my idea is the only idea or the only way. It's not. And I'm reminded of that, you know, often, that it's really all of us. I mean, we all have to put this together, and we're all very different and important in our, let's see, we call it our authentic self. So if you could find that person, who you are, your authentic self, that's the person you gotta be. That's the person we want you to be. I want you to be that person because there's no one else like you. To try and be like someone else is not your authentic self. I want to hear what you have to say, what you have to say and what you need and what you want. Just me, I'm just I'm just one of us. I'm just one of us. So I guess my work in peace, or what my involvement in peace is just ongoing. It's ongoing, and it's always listening and always trying to get to the place where we all are one. And because then I'm going from as we aspire, so do we rise. As we aspire, we open our eyes, and so do we see. And this is a long journey. And who are we going to be? Are we going to be one? So, thank you very much. As we aspire, so shall we become.